Morning. Thanks, Suresh. Thanks, Srini, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. Like Srini mentioned, I've seen a bit of life in corporate. I was part of a startup venture which grew to fairly large scale, a company called Sierra Atlantic. I was the CFO with them almost since inception, part of a founding team. Took the company public, took the company private, grew it back to a very good scale, and then Hitachi came knocking on our doors. They acquired us. Post the acquisition, I stayed on for 3 years as the CEO of Hitachi Consulting, which was earlier Sierra Atlantic. So I had a chance to look at the world, had a chance to benefit as part of a startup ecosystem myself. And now, since the last 2 years, I'm a charter member TiE. I'm a fairly active member of the Indian Angel Network. I've done about 12 early stage investments, mostly angel stage, a few of them in Hyderabad too. So I'm very happy to be here to share some part of my learnings, my experience with all of you. Very happy to keep it interactive, so feel free to jump in. And before I start, I just want to mention that I'll be taking more of a investor perspective to this topic, very important topic of customer validation, right? So typically, and I'm sure some of you have already faced, I have a few friends here, some of you may have faced a variety of investor pitch meetings. So I think clearly, what do investors look for before they invest in early stage startups? There are three key factors which we all look for, right? What is the business problem which this venture is addressing, right? That's very important. I see a few startups sometimes, younger startups starting with a business solution and then looking for a problem to address. I think that's the wrong way to start the entire process, right? So it's very important to be very clear about what problem are you trying to address, right? So that's clearly a big one. That takes us to what is the size of the market when you are trying to address this problem, right? So there is a global size of the market which you can address at some point in your roadmap. There is more of a national level, city level size of market, which is easier to reach at your early stage of investment. Because one looks at a startup venture as a trying to reach the summit, right? So if you're climbing Mount Everest, there are base camps. So you start with base camp, 0, base camp 1, base camp 2. So what investors look for is that at each stage, the investment which you are seeking, how far will that investment take you up, right? So what is very important is from a size of the market. So what's the business problem? What's the size of the market? Is the market big enough to make it interesting for an early stage investor to invest? Because early stage investors are taking the highest risk possible. At success rates which are less than 5% today, you are looking at 95% of most early stage investments failing, right? And it's a tough number, right? And I don't state this in trying to discourage any of you. I think there are a variety of factors which go into such high rate of failures. But what you need to know is that early stage investors are adjusting their return requirements to adjust for the risk involved. So if you were the investor, if you were investing $200,000 in a venture which had 5% chances of success, what's the return you would look for? Can I take any inputs? 10 times. Pardon? 10 times, yeah. So 3 to 5 years return, one actually looks at 20 to 30x return in a 3 to 5 year period. And the reason why it looks so unreasonable and it looks almost Shylockish, as they say, Shakespeare's Shylock, right? So he always wanted very high interest and return, is that the risk-adjusted return of a 20 to 30x over a 5 year period is just beyond 24% per annum. So you have to understand that perspective. That's important, right? So the size of the market, at what potential can this venture take you up to? Can it give that returns? The third point is, How differentiated is your venture, your offering, because of which you have a healthy chance of achieving a substantial market share in this market. So if the market size globally is $1 billion, on a national level is say $200 million, and at a city level, the market size is $10 million, can your venture actually have a chance of achieving a 5% of this market at a city level, national level, and a global level? So that's about the differentiation part of it, right? And the third point, and I'm diverging a little bit from the topic, but I need to bring that perspective into the topic. The third key point is, of course, the founding team, right? It's you. It's you and your co-founders. So the early stage investors are looking at what is the pedigree of the founder team, right? What's the domain understanding? Which part of the experience, which part of the fire in the belly, which part of the readiness to run the triathlon, right? So this is not a marathon, this is a triathlon, where you are running, you are cycling, and you are going to be swimming, right? So a startup founder's job is never easy. I think it's easier to be an investor than to be a founder, okay? I must tell you that. So which part of the founder's background, strengths, variety of factors, chutzpah, you call it, never say die, is ensuring that the founder will run this triathlon successfully and take the venture up, okay? And frankly, early stage investors are really what you call a nurture capital ecosystem, right? You need to understand that. And this is something we all discuss among the investors too, that early stage investment is not for everybody. I mean, if somebody is looking at a 1 year, 2 year return, forget it. That's not the right place for that investor to be in. Because early stage investing is really, you put in the money, then you provide, your time, your experience to share around strategy, around product building, around team building, introduction to customers, a variety of factors which can help the entrepreneur be successful. So that's really what is about startup investing. And a key portion of what I mentioned brings us to customer validation, right? One of the things one sees all the time is that the whole process of starting with an idea. So I'm a young startup founder, and I sort of been reading so many reports about Uber doing well and Airbnb doing well and Tesla going to a $40 billion market cap, and Flipkart closer to India, 9-year period, $16 billion market cap. So I want to jump in and start my own startup, right? So yes, I mean, there is no entry barrier right now. Actually, if you have dropped out, you are more successful chances of being a good startup founder, right? So, but what becomes important is, this is not something which you can just walk in and start doing, and I find this again, and that's where the whole validation part comes in, that I was talking to a youngster and he said, sir, I'm starting a food startup. It's in the ordering side. I built a lovely platform, and I need some money. So I said, yeah, okay, tell me a little more. So why did you think of this startup? So he said, no, I tried ordering, and Food Panda sucks, and Swiggy wasn't able to deliver on time, and I was sitting in Gachibowli and nobody has good service there, so that's why I decided I want to do this. I said, I mean, have you done a little research? Have you done some market, study? No, sir, not really, but I think, this is a good idea, so I've already invested 25 lakhs on building the platform, and I'm planning to, start with my sort of beta release sometime soon. But no, I think it's never that easy. I think what is clearly important is you have to do a lot of background research before you are coming in. So, well, that was a longish preamble, but what is customer validation? And I have a nice quote which I picked up by Rob May. He was the co-founder at Backupify. Customer discovery is about getting the product people want. So that's simple, right? That's clear. But customer validation is about finding a repeatable, scalable business model around that product. Key terms, repeatable and scalable, right? It's not just about ephemeral requirement. It's not about that there was a short problem, there was a burst, and this was needed. That's not enough, right? Many first-time entrepreneurs do not realize that there are many good products that people love that are ultimately bad businesses. Customer validation tries to figure that out as quickly as possible. Do you mostly agree with this definition? Yeah? I think, extremely important that you cannot just sort of take a few data points and begin to run with them. I think the amount of market research which is required as you are launching your venture, the amount of feet on the street which you need to spend, okay? And that's the other thing I see all the time, right? I see a lot of founders from the technology background assuming that every startup can be run just by technology alone. And frankly, that's rarely the case. I often ask founders to give me a weightage of what they feel is the weight in their business on technology, on the actual operations, and on the customer acquisition side. And very often I find that founders with a strong technology background tend to give a weightage to technology of 50 to 60 to 70%. And most often, the weightage to the platform, to the technology, yes, unless you are like Uber and Airbnb, and we'll all hopefully get there, that weightage is no more than 20%. Any business, it could be healthcare, it could be transportation, it could be education, whatever business you are in that business and you are delivering a solution, you are solving a problem using technology. That's something which you have to be very clear about, okay? And that's where, so the whole customer validation aspect, getting out there, understanding the customer's requirement, understanding the whole rhythm of the business, understanding what the customer interface points are, understanding what can take you to customer delight is extremely important. So let me move on. How does customer validation help you, right? So it helps you in answering these critical questions. What is the target market which I'm trying to address? And how big is the addressable market size? The more, sharply, the more sort of with rigor you do your customer validation process, it gives you a lot more clarity on building your entire assumptions, your plan, your target areas, right? Extremely important. In fact, while at this point, one of the aspects which I always recommend to startup founders is to be very clear about building an identity kit of your customer. That's extremely important. What is the demographic of your customer? What is the shape and size of your customer, right? So if I'm in an education startup, for example, which is delivering on-demand tutoring to students of class, let's say 8th to 12th, okay? So I've been mentoring a startup which has an on-demand tutor solution, right? So very clear, English and math, class 8 to class 12, right? So what is the demographic of this customer? That's a function of what is the service you want to deliver, what is the price you intend to charge, and some of that feeds upon each other, right? So the demographic is that the customer is the student / the parent, right? Because at younger ages, the parent is the customer. The customer is mostly urban to begin with, may expand to tier 2, tier 3. The customer is English speaking. The customer's economic background is annual income of say 15 lakhs and above, right? So every aspect around that, the more sharply you can define it, the more clearer you will be about your offering, the more clearer you can actually invest your customer acquisition dollars into. I find that when startups do not have a very clear picture of which target segment they are looking at, they tend to sort of let their customer dollars, flow on the ground and hope that return comes. That's never good enough, okay? But yeah, so coming back to, what's the target market? How big is the addressable market size? What is the biggest problem these people face, right? Is it a one-off problem? or is it a recurring problem? Again, very important aspect from a market clarity, right? So you have to be very clear that is this something which is here to stay? Is the problem you are addressing a problem which is here to stay? Is it going to grow? Is it flattening out? Because it's very important, again, to study economics, to study history in every part of entrepreneurship. It's very important to have a very broad approach to open the windows to the world, okay? And I'll give you an example of a product which some of you may have seen, some of you may never have seen, right? So way back in the communication world, there was a product called a pager. Any of you heard of a pager? Yeah, some of you have, okay. I thought only I was among the older guys here, so nice to know that, right? So pager was a very interesting, important product. When it came in, it was like a status symbol. You spent 15,000 rupees to buy the pager, and there was a monthly subscription of like 2,000 rupees, and it would give you nice text messages and running text like your stock ticker, right? And then you flaunted it because you could show that you had enough resources to buy a pager, and the pager died a very quick death, right? So the guys who came with the pager, the whole pager technology, of course, it was very useful while it was there, So emergency situations, healthcare, and stuff like that. But I think somewhere the whole telecom, the technology around communication was scaling so rapidly that it just died a quick death, right? There was a system called Iridium, which was a necklace of satellites across the world, right? Again, fascinating, large investments and all, but it sort of went off, right? So I think those are important aspects of your customer validation, right? Then you look at what kind of a product would help relieve that pain. Are these real people? Are there real people willing to pay for a product if it existed? See, again, this brings us to a very interesting part of market validation, okay? And I'm just trying to share as much of practical inputs as I come across and see very frequently, right? So the whole aspect of paying for the product. I see a bunch of startups who are coming with consumer sort of applications, right? So there was somebody in a social network, somebody in a mobile bill tracking platform and things like that, somebody in the news platform. So a bunch of startups, right, which are customer facing, consumer facing, B2C, right? So, they have fantastic, very nice pitch, very nice product. And then you start talking about as an investor, so okay, so what's your revenue model looking like? And pat comes the answer. No, sir, I'm looking at a freemium model, right? So, okay, so tell me, freemium model is what? So yeah, it's free for some time, and then I'll charge a premium as soon as I get 1 million users or 2 million users. So it's a freemium model. But I think in the next 2 years, market size like 2 billion users, and don't you think I can get 1% of that market size? So million users, and that's not a problem. It's very easy. I said, okay, so what's the cost of customer acquisition which you are factoring in? He says, sir, I'm looking at maybe 5 rupees per user acquisition. I said, no, my dear friend. Acquiring customers costs you anywhere between, can anybody take a guess on a B2C business average? She's right, absolutely. Anywhere from $5 to $10 per user, right? So if you want to acquire 1 million users, before which you can come nowhere close to being considered by anybody, right? The virtuous cycle requirement is 1 million, 2 million, 5 million users. If you want to acquire 1 million users at $5 per user customer acquisition cost, what are you looking at? $5 million just to buy customers. Again, yeah, maybe a lot of startups can do it. Somebody has a very rich father-in-law, mother-in-law, blah, blah, whatever. That's fine. That's a good way to go. But coming back to pricing, right? So what happens? Why do startups stumble about pricing? Why are startups nervous about pricing their product? Again, customer validation, market validation. Startups are sometimes nervous because there is a lack of confidence in the value of your product. For an investor, that is reflecting that. And I like to bring an example. If you look at bottled water, right? And fortunately, I think Mahindra respects water well, so these are all refilled bottles, right? 10 years back, less than 2% of people were paying for bottled water in India. Today, I don't know, 70% of middle class, which we are all part of, we cheerfully pay for bottled water. Anywhere from 10 rupees at a store to 200 rupees at a five-star hotel, and you don't even blink, you don't even look at the bill because it doesn't look convenient in your company, you know. You pay 200 rupees for bottled water. You pay, 200 rupees for a Pepsi when you go to a multiplex, right? So if customers are willing to pay 1,000 rupees for a theater experience, why can't they pay you, whatever, 20 rupees, 100 rupees for your product or for your app, right? Maybe not a direct comparison, and maybe I'm unfairly using this part, but it's a point to ponder, okay? You have to be very clear that whatever product, whatever service, whatever platform you are bringing as an entrepreneur, you have to be convinced that that is actually adding value. And in my experience with the enterprise, I've been on the selling side, I've been on the buying side as CFO and then CEO. Believe me, right? All buyers, every consumer who's parting with their money are willing to part with their money as long as you can convince them of the value. We are all consumers. We all have a value perception. We are all willing to pay a certain value. Now, that's part of the point which you need to be very clear about. Any of you use Office 365, Microsoft's, right? I mean, such a fantastic pricing model. I'm not pitching for Microsoft. I have nothing to do with them, right? But I'm a user. It gives me 4 licenses which I can share with my wife and my 2 kids who are grown up and in school. For 4,600 rupees a year, I have a completely updated, completely legal version of Office 365. That's such an elegant model, right? What, 400 rupees per month or less? Look at the entire model. I subscribe to a very interesting document site called Scribd. And I'll give you that example, right? So why did I subscribe to that? I was looking, I had a startup which was in the social media space, and I was looking for a pitch deck of Snapchat. So I hit a search, I said, pitch deck, Snapchat, first pitch deck. So it came up on Scribd, S-C-R-I-B-D, right? For some of you who may not have heard of it. But it said, listen, we have it, but it's in the premium version. So would you like to subscribe? Yeah, so then I look at it, and it says $40 for an annual subscription. It's got 100,000 books on it. It's got all sorts of documents. $40, done. I just click pay and done. So the point is that very often it's in our mind that you just want to kick the can down the road, say that I'll price it later, we'll think about it later. There's not much later, okay? So market validation, very clear size of market, what type of customer are you addressing, and what type of price can you charge for your product or service. Yeah.
One question, just on the first question, how big is the addressable market size?
Yes.
So when we are pitching in front of the investor, so I'm sure that they would be interested in getting a quantified value.
Of course.
So if suppose how do we reach that quantification? Because suppose the market is big enough, and
Yeah.
we are not able to reach all the different segments.
Right.
Then can it be an approximate value?
It can be absolutely approximate. See, for some markets, there is published data, right, which are well understood, and maybe a KPMG or some of the big 4, Accenture, some of them may have published reports on the market. Some markets, there could be listed companies which are operating in those markets. So they could be data. I mean, you also have to be an intelligent, sort of research approach, okay? So if you look at as companies go public, I'll take an example of a company which just listed called Healthcare Global Enterprises. It's an oncology setup which listed on Bombay Stock Exchange 2 days back, okay? In the prospectus document which they file for IPO, there is always a huge amount of industry data. about what is the industry, which part of it, because public listed companies, because of their compliance and regulatory requirements, are required to be hugely transparent about a lot of data. So the best source to get data often is if you can find a public company in that space, you will get a lot of data. Okay? So, but yeah, to answer your question, you can approximate, but you should give the basis of your model. So when I was using the tutor model, right? So you say, okay, India's population, 1.2 billion. Middle class, 350 million. Out of the 350 million, youngsters in the age group of 8 to 15, you say 20 million, right? Out of 20 million, tier 1, tier 2 cities, maybe 5 million. Out of 5 million, so that's the size of my market today. So you say out of 5 million, you take a conservative estimate to say, I can get 2% of this 5 million market, right? And that's the way to go. You can approximate, investors totally get that, but be logical and don't be, over sort of optimistic with your assumptions. That's important, right? If you're realistic, everybody understands.
And so in the second last question, are there real people willing to pay for such a product if it existed?
Yeah.
Now, suppose in this case, like if I'm discussing with one or two people, so they are interested. So the only thing is that I have to express them and tell them about the solution which is going to be there. So now when they are, so can I take it, if two people are agreeing, so can I take it as a model to agreeing with all the people, all the market size, or I have to take a multiple number of agreements?
Yeah, exactly. That's the purpose of my entire presentation today, that two is not real people.
Okay.
It has to be a function of the market. So if you are targeting a 2 million people market, you probably have to do 5,000 people customer survey.
Okay.
That's important.
Okay.
See, again, we are all as founders, we are enamored by what we think. It's a human tendency to even hear what you want to hear and filter out what you don't want to hear.
And most of the time you hear what you want to hear.
Exactly. So yeah, by real people, and there's another slide which comes to that, the market size which you are surveying has to be substantial enough to make it happen. It has to be substantial, it has to be diverse. It cannot just be in Hyderabad. It cannot just be in high-tech city, right? In fact, while at this point, and I keep jumping into philosophy and other stuff, right? One of the things I find very fascinating is, in an organization of even 20 people, making change happen is so difficult, right? Do you all agree? Even within a family of 4 people, if you want to take a health approach to say, okay, all 4 of us will start running, get up at 6 o'clock and run, all 4 people will have a different tendency. But what I find fascinating and bewildering is entire cities have a culture. I don't know if you guys agree with me, right? Hyderabad has a culture, Mumbai has a culture, Chennai has a culture, Kolkata has a culture, Delhi has a culture. And these are like 8 million, 10 million people imbibing a culture. I like to say, right from a dhobi to a CEO, they have that same culture. A dhobi in Hyderabad will be happy to come to your home once in 4 days. In Mumbai, he'll take your clothes and come back in 2 hours and deliver, because that's the value of his time. It's crazy. So, why I'm saying that is, when you do a survey, it has to be rich enough, it has to be diverse enough to ensure that you are actually cancelling out any of the false positives there. Yeah?
And so this confirmation has to be for the solution or for the company also?
For the solution.
For the solution only.
Actually, the company is the solution, is it not?
No, maybe it might be that the people are happy with the solution and they trust me as a person also. But then it comes the third aspect of the company.
Which is?
Which is whether they, as a whole, they won't be willing to trust that as a whole.
Yeah, then you should change those parts which they are not trusting. But if your solution is good, that's a good start. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah. Absolutely.
For example, we know Domino's, we don't know Jubilant.
Correct. Very true. Very true. Very true. That's why if the product or service is validated, that's a good start, right? It's easier to change some components of the company which are, sort of not the core part, right?
Company, or you're branding a product or a service. So that may reflect.
Okay. Yeah, so are there real people willing to pay? Will building it be worth it? Is the market big enough? We have covered that in multiple ways. And am I building the right product, right? So I think each of these questions are very important, and customer validation helps you to answer those questions. A quick, I'll just take 2 minutes on this. The playbook on customer discovery. Basically, prototype, release MVP using a free model to begin with, okay? Get feedback across segments. We covered that, right? The demographic of the customer. Iterate, strengthen product with solid UI, UX focus, and achieve a must-have factor of over 50% users. So the must-have part is important here, right? One of the key things one always looks at in customer validation is your product good to have? Is it must-have? And maybe that definition, doesn't work well with all products. So they could be luxury products and things like that. You take the Mercedes-Benz brand, right? The car brand. There was a survey done which said if Mercedes-Benz were to reduce the prices of their cars, their sales would actually fall. Can you believe that? Because the whole raison d'etre for Mercedes-Benz is that they are a luxury segment, right? There is an aspirational value to a Mercedes-Benz. And maybe today it's to Audi or whatever, right? So Bugatti or something else, Porsches. But the point is, coming back, it's very important to have a healthy enough market. Your product, your service, your offering should fall into a must-have. And that links back to the value also, right? So yeah, I mean, you could have leisure travel, right? So you have Stayzilla and you have a lot of travel advisory firms now. But gradually, as the Indian middle class has more disposable income, as you have a lot of advertising, as you have a lot of bloggers, opinion makers, peer inspiration, I won't say peer pressure, many of us want to travel more, right? You want to learn about the world. So it's moving towards the must-have bracket too, right? So things like that, yeah? Okay, different models of going to market. I found this interesting. It's not very readable, so I don't know what to do with it. But so let me just try and walk you through that, yeah? Is it readable at the screen? Yeah, I'll stand beside the, Okay, no. So this is really the difference between a 20th century tech startup which started with a product vision and went on to, oh God, I can't even use my, that side is visible? How, going to market, Steve Blank, the very interesting sort of blogger, how the difference between 20th century tech startups, 21st century startups, lean tech startup, and then design thinking, right? So 20th century startups would go, founder has a product vision, you build the entire product, and then you go to find customers. So launch diving driven by business plan, and then you hire sales staff. So, this was a sort of linear, old-fashioned approach, right? So the current approach, which we are talking about right now, is the 21st century lean tech startup approach, which is, it's an asset-light approach, right? So lean tech automatically means you need more bang for the buck. You get funding, but you get funding to go to Basecamp 1 or Basecamp 2, and by that time, you have to get maximum, sweating for the money. So you have a founder's product vision, you build MVPs, you go out, get customer validation, iterate, pivot, till you get to a right enough form of validation, good enough data, then you have a launch timing driven by customer validation and hire sales staff. And the third part, which may not be relevant today, but I thought it's important to just discuss, is from a design thinking process, right? You actually start not with a founder's product vision, but with what a customer needs. And the whole design thinking process is being greatly driven by Mr. Sikka, the new CEO at Infosys. Actually, globally, design thinking is very big. And I think for all startups, that's really a very, very logical, very structured approach to taking up whatever you are taking up, right? So there's actually a very interesting book by Tim Brown, who's the founder of IDEO, the Stanford Design Lab. I don't remember the title. It says, the design approach to life or something like that, but very fascinating. I had a chance to read that book. Pardon? The Design of Everything. Yeah, thank you. Have you read that book? Okay. Isn't it very engaging? Yeah. So definitely worth trying out. Okay. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting to show you the 3 approaches to the whole process. Now this slide, I've done a little bit of cheating, so bear with me on that. I've basically taken jungle lore in customer validation. So I wanted to touch upon successes and failures, but some of these are in parts of history. I don't know if they all correlate to not having done customer validation or not, but I just wanted to illustrate the point that there have been large, very well-established companies which have failed miserably on new product launches, right? And how does that happen? So it's not just that a startup actually falls prey to, being blindsided by not having done enough validation, okay? And actually, I like, one of Warren Buffett's statements where he talks about how the largest of companies fall, trip, get destroyed by what he calls ABC: arrogance, bureaucracy, and complacency. It's a fascinating and a very simple capture of 3 attributes, which I think all of us individually, as a corporate, as a startup, we all need to stay away from, right? And again, not doing customer validation is complacency. It's arrogance, right? Because if you are receptive, if you are sensitive to your customer, you'll rarely fail. But I'll just quickly run through. So first, the failures. Ford, way back, and this is covered in, I think, the book, recommended by Bill Gates, Business Adventures. So the whole Excel story. Ford spent in 1957 close to, I don't know, some $200 million in coming out with a model which totally tanked, right from the name to the features to everything else. But it was a pet project of the Ford, the CEO, the founder, the owner, and it bombed. The new Coke, they experimented with their formula, didn't do enough validation, possibly, so I'm attributing it to that right now, failed. Apple's PDA, just like the pager, right? So there used to be a PDA, the predecessor to the smartphone, touch and everything. There was a stylus and stuff. Microsoft's iPod killer, Zune, boom. Barnes & Noble, Nook, the e-reader, and Fiskars. And I must touch upon Fiskars and Tesla, okay? So this is a very interesting story, and actually I'm reading Elon Musk's biography right now by Ashley Vance, and it touches upon this one. Elon Musk, as he was, starting Tesla, he actually hires a designer to help him with the whole, designing of this next generation car, right? And this designer works with him for a year or so, and then decides that this is a great idea. He wants to start a company on his own. And he goes and starts an electric car company, an electric sports car company called Fiskars. And it's a very interesting story. So that's why have you heard of this investor called KPCB, Kleiner Perkins? One of the most iconic investors, right? Ray Lane, who was the ex-CEO of Oracle and one of the founding partners of KPCB, had a chance to invest either in Fiskars or in Tesla. And the difference in Fiskars, this was covered in a TiE Charter talk, if you remember. I think Mr. Rao, he had covered this point. The difference in Fiskars versus Tesla was only electric, right? So on a certain charge, it could travel a certain distance at a certain speed. It was not an hybrid. There was no backup model. Fiskars had a backup model. It was hybrid. It was electric plus gas. So if electric, the charge ran out, you could go on to gas and, continue ahead, right? Or at least reach your nearest charging station. And KPCB, Kleiner Perkins, invested in Fiskars, and they declined investing in Tesla. $200 million or some huge amount like that. And Fiskars totally bombed because nobody wanted to buy a hybrid car like that because it ended up being much heavier. It ended up having a bunch of things which didn't work. And frankly, the Tesla story, by the way, is very interesting because ground up company, right? I don't know how many of you know about this, but Elon Musk's entire philosophy is to build everything in-house. He does not believe in outsourcing. So whether it is SpaceX, the whole rocket startup, whether it is Tesla, I don't know. It's a sort of dangerous strategy, right? I mean, it's going against the whole logic of the world, where you stay with core competence and you outsource and you bring back and assemble and go, right? Keep your IP, keep your core stuff. Elon Musk does not believe in that. His software, the entire software upgrade. So Tesla, you know, the electric car, I think some of our charter friends might have a couple of them too, but it's so fascinating that the entire software is ground up, built ground up, the entire manufacturing plant, and it's a fascinating story there too, because Tesla actually bought a manufacturing plant which was being wasted in Fremont, which was a joint venture of Toyota and General Motors called NUMMI. So he got a chance to buy a near brand new plant for a throwaway value, which he was able to convert into the manufacturing for Tesla. He used all aluminum body, lightweight body, a phenomenal battery technology, completely homegrown software approach, which remains a beautiful advantage today. So an amazing story, okay? But I diverge from the customer validation, but I thought I must mention a few success stories and failures, and I attribute the failures to lack of customer validation, just to underline my point, okay? Moving on, I hope I'm doing okay on time. Pitfalls of ignoring customer validation, right? So, yeah, we talked about the blindsiding, right? So we understand the target market. Everybody starts with a solution. They know what customers want, not good enough. To your point, friends, family, and colleagues think it is a great product. Counterpoint, intellectual inbreeding leads to gene defects, right? In Israel, right, there is a concept of a devil's advocate, which has reached the world over. It's a very well-established strategic approach now. So in any exec meeting world over, in mature corporations, every group of strategists, every board, every sort of decision-making body has one member who is appointed as the devil's advocate. That member's duty is to disagree, is to question, is to healthily challenge what is happening, right? Because when you have too many A-sayers, yes-sayers, right, you miss out on certain important aspects in your life. Comes to customer validation also. Very important, okay? And by the way, while on Israel, I didn't know this, so another interesting data point. The Israeli army is the only army in the world where there is no hierarchy. A private can question a general and say, but he needs to say General Sir, right? He can't say by first name Sanjay or whatever. But he can say, General Sir, I think you are wrong. And he will be accepted. It's the only army in the world. If you try saying it in any other army in the world, you'll be shot within the next 2 minutes. That's all. No court-martial required. But that's part of a healthy skepticism approach, which actually builds a much better DNA. Been a hard enough time to get the product out. Why should I lose time to persuade others, right? Pitfalls of not doing customer validation. Reluctance to submit weakens the product. I don't want to, I'm sorry, I missed the T there. Don't want to have to change my product. Again, very nice Chinese saying, which I like a lot. It says, no matter how far you have gone down the wrong path, turn back. I think all of us as human beings, tend to think, especially men. I think ladies are better at finding directions, but men don't want to ask for directions, right? So this applies in startups also. Extremely important, right? Better to cut the loss and move on, okay? So yeah, some of these thoughts are from a blogger called Martin Sorju, very interesting person. So that's pretty much it. I just, I think I covered a lot of points during my slides. I've probably taken enough of my time, but I can open up for Q&A. Yeah, please. Can I have the lights? Can we have the lights back? Yeah.
Then you have a lot of people to approach and ask, right? Sure. But if the product is for a set of specific users, then there itself the target people for your surveys is cut down a little bit. But then in those cases, like when they are like serious businesses or people
Enterprise, even for
enterprises,
enterprise
and things,
product.
enterprises
Sure,
or
sure.
small businesses, whatever.
Sure.
To get the time itself is a big thing, right, for surveys. And as you have been mentioning, change is something that everybody is afraid of. So the moment you go for a survey, they're afraid that this guy is going to sell me something.
Sure.
And the survey result may be impacted due to that kind of hidden. So what would be a good approach to
Sure.
go and get surveys done and find people who are willing to give a good? What could be your advice
Absolutely.
in that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think wonderful question. The question is that when you have a more limited set of users, and all of us react similarly to sales approaches, right? Don't waste my time. I don't want to sort of sit down and spend that time with you. Yeah, I think there are several businesses which face that, and frankly, you can take multiple approaches, right? So I would almost look at that. If you can understand the prospect's business, let's say you decide that you want to approach 100 customers across 5 cities, right? So you understand that customer's business a little better. You build a small 1-pager or a 2-pager sort of case study to show how your product or your service can help address certain pain points in the customer's business, right? And if you go with a solution where you are sitting in the shoes of the customer, I have always found that customers are far more receptive to that. Frankly, even in our sort of Sierra Atlantic Hitachi days, one aspect we very successfully deployed was we used to have a lot of customer prospects visiting us, CFO, CEO, CTO visiting us, right? And this would be like, the whole, what's that called, sort of fashion parade, right? So they are visiting 4 different companies. They are coming to Tech Mahindra, Infosys, Sierra Atlantic, and whatever. So all companies tend to start presenting themselves first, right? And one thing we adopted very successfully is we would ask the customer to first present about their business and about their pain point. And as the customer was presenting, our team was customizing our pitch, our corporate pitch, to align to the customer pain points. And believe me, instead of torturing the customer and putting them through about Sierra Atlantic, about my variety of offerings, if we went to the offering which mapped to the customer's pain point or points, a lot of customers actually thanked us to say, thank you for not torturing us and thank you for directly coming to the point, okay? So I'll use that to answer your question to say, if you decide there are 100 prospects which you want to address across 5 different cities, right? You bunch them into certain industry segments. You don't need to do work for 100 prospects. They would all fall under 4 or 5 industry segments. Bunch them into industry segments, study that industry, map your product or service to the pain points in that industry, and go with an approach which shows that these are the pain points which we believe you may be facing. These are the points we are addressing, and this is the ROI. The last mile is to clearly articulate the ROI which can flow to the customer. I think that gets to people. And frankly, out of 100 doors you knock, 20 doors may not open. They may just say, listen, I'm busy, right? But again, I've seen both through personal and through success stories which you read about, that it's your approach, I had a startup whom I was asking, so what's your PR approach? And that startup said, sir, I keep approaching a lot of PR people, publications, but nobody's speaking about us. So I said, no, that's not the publication's problem, it's your problem. Maybe we are not articulating it well enough, right? So I see that again, even with enterprise users at a variety of levels, how you articulate your mail or how you reach out through a known person, through a connection, everything matters. I'll give you an example of Slack. Have you heard of Slack? Slack is a collaboration software tool, right? B2B, okay? Slack entered as a Trojan horse into enterprise. It was basically a free tool which developers could use to just collaborate with each other. And it entered and it became a tsunami within the enterprise, where today it is one of the fastest growing companies in the enterprise space in the world today, valued at more than $12 billion. Amazing story. but they came in through the back door. They didn't knock on the main door at all. Okay? So I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's a beautiful story. Actually, I didn't know that part, right? So you do a stupid thing and later you look much more intelligent because the baseline has taken you to being stupid, right? No, but thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that, you know. But it's very interesting. Actually, while on Coke, you know, this whole paperboard story, very inspiring, right? Indian founders, who could ever imagine that you can compete against a Coke and Pepsi with advertising budgets of, I don't know how many 100 crores per year, right? And they have actually carved out a market share for themselves, differentiated product, differentiated packaging, captured the imagination. Amazing. I think there's one more question. Sridevi, one last question. Yeah.
Yeah, so my startup is Architect Corner, and we have a tactile internet platform.
Architect Corner.
Yeah.
Okay.
Targeting 5G users and 5G network. So it's something next generation. And
Okay.
one of the questions I have while going through the customer validation is most of them will be 3G at 4G, right? So is there any way, I mean, calculating the market size and validating the customer business is fine, but in terms of what are the challenges and how long will it take, is there any way to project based on 3G, 4G implementation?
Yeah, I think you could probably, you know, sort of do that, take a basis, take an assumption and try doing that. Or if I heard you right, in the telecom 5G business, right? So you could look at maybe 5G markets which are out there. So Japan and Korea and some of these markets, and look at trying to map on some of the, you know, companies, some of the offerings and their customer responses, and then show that, you know, this is already happening. 5G has been launched. This is the reception which it's getting. And this is why we feel this is the future here today. So you could use a combination of both, yeah. Okay? Thank you. Thanks, Sridevi. Over to you.